My name is Sarah Mitchell, and I am 27 years old. Last night, my parents sat across from me at a high-end restaurant, smiling as they slid a document across the white tablecloth, asking me to sign away my legal rights to our family's lakefront estate. They thought I was still the quiet, compliant daughter who would blindly sacrifice her future to salvage my brother's third bankrupt business venture. What they didn't know was that 3 hours earlier, a real estate attorney had locked the door of her downtown office, looked me in the eye, and confirmed that my grandmother had secretly moved that entire property into an irrevocable trust under my name years before she passed. When I pushed the unsigned document back across the table and recited the exact trust file number, my mother's face went completely bloodless, and my father's hands began to shake so violently he spilled his wine across the linen. Before we dive into how a single quiet promise flipped a multi-million-dollar family dynamic completely upside down, please take a brief moment to like and subscribe, but only if this story of hidden boundaries truly speaks to you. Drop your city and your local time in the comments below. I read every single one because I want to know exactly where you are listening from tonight. Now let me take you back 7 years, to a humid July afternoon at Cedar Lake, and the last time I ever saw my grandmother hold a paintbrush with steady hands. Growing up in the Mitchell household, there were 2 distinct realities, but only one child who was permitted to occupy the foreground. My older brother, Bradley, was 3 years my senior. From the moment he entered the world, he was treated as the crown prince of our family's legacy. He was loud, charismatic, and effortlessly confident, the kind of boy who could track mud across my mother's pristine hardwood floors and receive a fond laugh instead of a reprimand. My parents, Arthur and Evelyn Mitchell, valued 2 things above all else: social standing and the preservation of Bradley's ego. Arthur owned a mid-sized commercial brokerage firm in Columbus, Ohio, and Evelyn managed our suburban household with a rigid, country club perfectionism. Bradley was their golden child, their walking billboard, and their ultimate investment. I was the quiet one. I was the daughter who spent her summers tucked away in the corner of the screened-in porch, analyzing biology diagrams and reading classical literature while Bradley held court by the boat dock. I wasn't rebellious, and I wasn't difficult. I was simply a fixture of the background. There is a profound difference between being actively disliked and simply never being seen in the first place. Here is a small, precise example of how the math worked in our home. When I was 16, I placed first in the statewide math Olympiad, an achievement that earned me a formal commendation letter from the governor. That exact same weekend, Bradley crashed his custom dirt bike into a neighbor's retaining wall during an unpermitted race. My parents spent 48 hours frantic, handling the neighbor's insurance claims, hearing a private repair crew, and comforting Bradley so he wouldn't feel bad about the accident. When I finally found a quiet moment at the kitchen island to show my father the blue ribbon and the governor's letter, he glanced up from his spreadsheet, rubbed his temples, and sighed. "That's nice, Sarah. Just leave it on the counter. Your mother and I are dealing with a real crisis right now." He didn't ask what the competition entailed. He never did. I told myself it didn't hurt. I told myself that validation didn't matter as long as I kept my head down and built my own foundation. I poured every ounce of my energy into my high school grades, my advanced placement classes, and my university applications. I figured if I couldn't be the child they naturally noticed, I would become the daughter whose objective success they couldn't logically ignore. And for one brief, beautiful summer, I actually believed I had succeeded. The day I received my official acceptance letter into Ohio State University's Integrated Business and Honors Finance program, something shifted in our household. For the first time in my life, my father looked at me across the dinner table and didn't look through me. He looked directly into my eyes and smiled. "Honors Finance," Arthur said slowly, testing the weight of the words. "A real degree. Perhaps you'll be the one to manage the family assets after all, Sarah." It wasn't a genuine compliment. It was a utility check. But to an 18-year-old girl who had spent a lifetime breathing the thin air of marginalization, it felt like oxygen. My mother called 3 of her neighbors that exact evening. Her voice carried a specific, high-pitched pride I had never heard directed at me before. "Sarah got the honors scholarship. Can you believe it? But you need to understand what Bradley did the moment he realized the family spotlight was shifting, even an inch away from his direction. Bradley was 21 at the time, pretending to study communications at a local community college while mapping out what he called his disruptive tech startup. In reality, he was spending my father's money on high-end club memberships and leased sports cars. At that dinner table, while my father spoke about my scholarship, Bradley didn't say a word. He smiled, but it was a flat, tight line that didn't affect his eyes. His gaze stayed fixed on me, calculating, measuring, and recalibrating the exact distance between his needs and my achievements. I know that look now. At the time, I just thought he was proud of his little sister. That week, Bradley started calling me more. He wanted to know about my class schedule. He asked about my finance professors, my corporate law modules, and my investment banking seminars. He asked me to explain how asset protection worked, how corporate structures were formed, and how high-net-worth individuals shielded their capital. I thought my brother was finally seeing me as an equal. I thought my academic success had finally unlocked a genuine connection between us, the kind of supportive, intellectual bond that normal siblings share. In reality, I was simply feeding him ammunition. I was handing over every detail, every structural dynamic, and every analytical framework with a grateful, trusting smile. The real fracture occurred during the winter of my junior year at university. That was the year my childhood safety fund vanished, and the year my grandmother, Evelyn Mitchell, decided she had seen enough. When I was born, my maternal grandparents had established a dedicated educational and safety fund under my name, a savings certificate designed to act as a financial launchpad when I turned 25. By the time I entered my third year of college, that fund had accrued interest and sat at exactly $85,000. I had planned to use it to pay off my minor student loans and secure a small down payment on an apartment in the city after graduation. On a rainy Tuesday morning in November, I went into my online banking portal to verify the quarterly interest statement. When the dashboard loaded, the account balance read 0. The account hadn't just been drawn from, it had been entirely liquidated. My chest went completely tight. I couldn't breathe. I called the branch manager immediately, my voice trembling so hard I could barely recite my security questions. The manager reviewed the transaction log and explained, with a sympathetic but detached professional tone, that the account had been closed out via a joint custodian authorization signature. My father, Arthur Mitchell, had signed the liquidation order 3 days prior. I left my lecture hall, drove straight to my parents' suburban home, and pushed through the front door. I found my mother and father sitting at the mahogany dining table, surrounded by glossy printed brochures, financial balance sheets, and a brand new leather portfolio bearing Bradley's initials. Bradley's tech venture, an app designed to connect luxury car owners with private detailing services, was hemorrhaging cash. He had already burned through his initial seed funding, my father's personal injection, and a $60,000 line of credit. The developers were threatening to strike, and the office lease was in default. "Where is my safety fund?" I stood at the edge of the room, my hands clenched into white fists inside my coat pockets. My father didn't look up from his spreadsheet. He simply clicked his pen, his face a mask of absolute, unbothered certainty. "We redirected those funds into Mitchell Ventures, Sarah. Your brother's company is on the verge of a massive breakthrough. He just needed a short-term liquidity bridge to clear his operational overhead." "That was my money," I said, my voice cracking down the center under the weight of the betrayal. "Grandpa left that for my future. You had no right to touch it." My mother set her coffee cup down with a sharp, clinking sound against the saucer. She looked at me with a flash of cold, maternal impatience. "Don't be selfish, Sarah. We are a family, and families sacrifice for one another when a real opportunity is on the line. Bradley is building an empire. When the company goes public, you'll get your $85,000 back with interest. Your father made a calculated business decision for the good of this household." "And what if it fails?" I asked, looking between their blank, defensive faces. "What if he burns through that money just like he burned through everything else?" My father finally looked up, His expression was arctic. "Bradley doesn't fail, Sarah. He just needs structural support. Now, please drop the attitude. This conversation is over." I stood in that pristine, silent dining room for 2 full minutes. The grandfather clock ticked in the hallway. The rain hit the windows. I looked at my parents, the people who were legally and morally supposed to protect my ground, and realized that to them, my future was nothing more than a cheap chip stack they could pull from my side of the table to fund Bradley's gambling habits. I didn't yell. I didn't cry. I turned around, walked out of the house, and drove 40 minutes north through the pouring rain to Cedar Lake. My grandmother Evelyn lived alone in a timber frame cottage nestled against the water, surrounded by ancient white pines that blocked the harsh winds. It was the place where my father had grown up, a property that had been in the Mitchell family since 1954. The porch sagged slightly on the lakeside. The screen door had a familiar, rhythmic creak, and the air inside always smelled of wood smoke, linseed oil, and old leather-bound books. It was the only place in the world where I had ever felt entirely safe. Evelyn was 76 then. Her silver hair was pinned back, her hands were calloused from decades of gardening, and her eyes held a sharp, unyielding clarity that neither my father nor my brother had ever been able to manipulate. When I pushed through her kitchen door, soaked and silent, she didn't ask a single question. She simply wrapped her worn cardigan around my shoulders, sat me down at the butcher block table her husband had built, and set a mug of hot tea in front of my hands. I sat there for an hour, the hot ceramic warming my palms, and I told her everything. I told her about the account, the liquidation, the luxury car app, and the flat, casual dismissiveness of my parents' voices. Evelyn listened without interrupting. She watched the rain ripple across the dark surface of the lake outside her window. Her jaw stayed completely set, and her thin, papery fingers tightened around her own teacup until her knuckles went stark white. When I finished speaking, she reached across the table, covered my hand with hers, and spoke with a quiet, terrifying steel. "Your father reads the world like a ledger, Sarah. He thinks he can cross out your name whenever Bradley's column runs red, but he forgets who built the foundation he's standing on." She stood up, walked to the old roll-top desk in the corner of her living room, and pulled a small, cream-colored business card from a hidden drawer. She slid it across the kitchen table toward me. The card read, "Margaret Vance, attorney at law, trusts, estates, and asset protection. You are going to call Margaret tomorrow morning from your university apartment," Evelyn told me, her voice dropping into a low, definitive register. "Don't call from your parents' house, and don't mention her name to your mother. Your grandfather and I built this lakefront property with our own hands, Sarah. And I promise you, on my life, Bradley will never touch a single splinter of it." I looked at the card in my hand. I didn't fully understand the legal mechanics of what she was planning. I was 21, grieving the loss of my safety fund and exhausted from years of invisibility. But I trusted Evelyn completely. I slipped the card into my wallet, drove back to my apartment, and made the call the following morning at precisely 9 o'clock. For the next 2 years, the lakefront cabin became my quiet, legal sanctuary. I graduated from university on time, earning my degree in finance with highest honors. My parents didn't attend the ceremony. Bradley's tech company had officially collapsed that exact weekend, filing for Chapter 7 bankruptcy after drowning in nearly $300,000 of debt. My father was locked in meetings with corporate liquidation attorneys, and my mother stayed home to manage Bradley's emotional fallout. They sent me a short text message on Monday morning. "Congratulations, Sarah. We'll celebrate when things settle down." They never did settle down. Within 6 months, Bradley had already convinced my father to finance his next venture, a commercial real estate syndication firm that required an immediate $150,000 cash injection. My father, desperate to restore his son's status, mortgaged a portion of his brokerage firm's assets to fund the project. Bradley bought a new designer suit, rented a luxury office space downtown, and began printing corporate brochures with his name listed as managing director. I took a job as a junior financial analyst at a corporate firm in the city, earning my own salary, paying my own rent on a tiny studio apartment, and driving out to Cedar Lake every single Saturday. My parents thought I went to the lake to escape. They thought I was out there sweeping pine needles off the roof and painting the porch steps out of some naive, sentimental attachment to my late grandmother's house. Evelyn's health had begun to decline rapidly in the winter of 2024, her breathing growing shallow, her vigorous frame turning frail against the cushions of her armchair. But her mind never dimmed for a single second. Every Saturday, while the wind howled across the frozen lake, Evelyn and I would sit by the stone fireplace with legal documents spread out across our laps. Margaret Vance, the trust attorney, would join us via secure video calls. I learned how an irrevocable trust functioned. I learned how a chain of title worked, how a deed transfer was recorded, and how a successor beneficiary status shielded a property from probate, creditors, and parental intervention. "They will come for this land, Sarah," Evelyn whispered to me one afternoon in December, her grip surprisingly strong as she held my wrist. "When Bradley's real estate venture falls apart, and it will fall apart because he builds on vanity, not substance, your father will look at this lakefront lot and see a quick cash payout. He will try to sell it to developers. He will try to leverage it for a loan. You must hold the line. Promise me you won't bend." "I promise, Grandma," I said, looking at the notarized signature page bearing my name on the second line. "I won't bend." Evelyn passed away peacefully in her sleep 3 weeks later. The funeral was held on a gray, freezing Tuesday in January. My parents sat in the front row of the chapel, wearing expensive wool coats and looking appropriately solemn for the cameras of their country club associates. Bradley stood beside my father, checking his watch every 15 minutes and whispering into his phone about an upcoming commercial closing. At the reception, I caught my father and Bradley standing by the bar, talking in low, urgent tones. Bradley had a manila folder tucked under his arm, and my father was nodding slowly, his face lighter than it had been in months. "The lakefront lot is unencumbered," Bradley whispered, just loud enough for my sharp ears to catch across the room. "Ridgeline Development offered $450,000 for the land alone. If we close by next month, we can clear the bank default and secure the Columbus acquisitions." "We'll handle it during probate next week," Arthur replied, clinking his glass against Bradley's. "It's a standard transfer between heirs. It won't take long." I stood near the door, holding my grandmother's plaid handkerchief, and felt a cold, familiar stone settle into the center of my chest. They were calculating the monetary value of her sanctuary before the funeral flowers had even begun to wilt. They had no idea that the property records at the county office had already been updated 6 months prior. They had no idea that the chain of title didn't lead to Arthur Mitchell at all. 3 months passed in absolute silence. I stayed away from my parents' house. I did my work, filed my financial reports, and checked in with Margaret Vance every Friday morning. Then, yesterday afternoon, my phone lit up with a text message from my mother. "Sarah, honey, your father and I want to take you to dinner at the Marble Room tonight at 7. We have some exciting family news to share. And we need to sign some routine estate paperwork to wrap up Evelyn's things. See you there." I didn't reply immediately. I called Margaret Vance. "They're moving," I told her. "I know," Margaret replied, her voice steady and clinical through the receiver. "Bradley's real estate firm just received a formal notice of default from the state bank. They are facing an immediate foreclosure on their commercial lines. Your father needs that lakefront property cleared and sold within the next 48 hours, or his own brokerage firm will be pulled into the litigation. I have the certified trust package ready for you, Sarah. Come to my office at 4. At 4 o'clock, I sat in Margaret's mahogany-lined office downtown. She slid a thick, leather-bound portfolio across her desk. Inside was a certified copy of the Mitchell Family Irrevocable Trust, the recorded quitclaim deed stamped by the county recorder's office, the affidavit of successor beneficiary status, and a public notice of pending legal interest. "The title is completely locked," Margaret told me, adjusting her reading glasses. "The moment your father attempts to record a transfer or a sale under his own name, the county system will automatically reject it. Legally, he owns nothing out there. You are the sole decision-maker." I took the portfolio, tucked it into my bag, and walked into the Marble Room at precisely 7 o'clock. The restaurant was the pinnacle of old-money Columbus luxury, crystal chandeliers, plush velvet booths, and an orchestra playing classical music quietly in the background. My parents and Bradley were already seated in a prime center booth. Bradley was wearing a $3,000 custom suit, a designer watch, and an expansive, confident smile. My father looked lighter, like a man who had just escaped a trap. My mother beamed as I approached, gesturing for the waiter to bring over a glass of white wine. "Sarah, darling," Elena leaned over to kiss my cheek, her expensive perfume hitting my sinuses. "You look wonderful, so professional." "Thanks, Mom," I said, sliding into the booth directly across from Bradley and my father. We ordered dinner. For 45 minutes, the conversation was an elaborate performance of family perfection. Bradley spoke at length about his upcoming, high-yield real estate acquisitions, using massive financial buzzwords he didn't fully understand to mask the fact that his company's bank accounts were completely dry. My parents nodded along with practiced adoration, reinforcing his narrative, treating him like a corporate savior. I stayed quiet. I ate my salad, drank my wine, and waited for the second movement of their script to begin. After the main course dishes were cleared, my father's demeanor shifted. He reached into his leather briefcase, pulled out a 3-page legal document, and slid it across the white tablecloth toward my hand, alongside an expensive silver pen. "Sarah, we need to handle a small, routine formality regarding Evelyn's estate," Arthur said, his voice carrying that smooth, boardroom authority he used to close difficult commercial transactions. "As next of kin, Bradley and I are restructuring the Cedar Lake property to clear up some family operational debts. This is a standard quitclaim waiver. It simply states that you waive any future probate claim to the lakefront lot so we can expedite the sale to Ridgeline Development. Sign at the bottom of page 3. I didn't pick up the silver pen. I didn't open the document. I simply looked at my father, then at my brother, whose eyes were locked on my hand with a desperate, hidden hunger. "And what happens to the $450,000 from that sale?" I asked, my voice completely level, completely calm. Bradley leaned forward, flashing his most charismatic, patronizing smile. "It's going straight into the firm's capital reserves, Sarah. It's a strategic move. Don't worry, we're going to set aside $10,000 for you as a bonus. It'll help you upgrade that little studio apartment of yours. Most girls your age would jump at that kind of cash." "10,000, I repeated, feeling the sheer, staggering weight of their arrogance fill the space between us. "Out of 450,000, for a property that grandfather built with his own hands." My mother's smile hardened, her lips pressed into a thin, dangerous line. "Sarah, don't start being difficult. This is business. Your brother needs this liquidity to clear a bank default. If we don't close this sale by Friday morning, your father's commercial brokerage will face a structural audit. We are a family, and you will sign that paper to protect this household." I looked down at the document on the table. Then I reached into my bag, pulled out the certified trust portfolio Margaret Vance had given me, and placed it directly on top of my father's unsigned quitclaim deed. "I won't be signing that paper, Dad," I said, looking directly into his eyes. "And you won't be selling the Cedar Lake property to Ridgeline Development, because 6 months ago, Grandma Evelyn moved that entire estate into an irrevocable trust. The chain of title was recorded under file number 2024 TR8842 at the county office. Legally, you don't own that land. I am the sole trustee, and I am the sole beneficiary." The silence that hit our table was so absolute it felt physical. Bradley's confident smile froze, then shattered completely. My father's eyes dropped to the certified county stamp on the front page of my portfolio, his face turning an ashen, mottled purple as he read the words *irrevocable transfer of ownership. My mother shot back against the velvet cushion of the booth, her hand flying to her mouth, her eyes wide with a dawning, frantic terror. "What did you do?" Bradley's voice came out as a strangled, desperate hiss. "What did you do, Sarah?" "I kept a promise," I said, leaning back against the booth, my spine perfectly straight, my hands perfectly steady under the crystal light. My mother's hand remained frozen against her mouth, her manicured fingers trembling against her skin as the reality of the trust documentation settled over the table. The classical music from the restaurant's orchestra seemed to warp into an uncomfortable, buzzing background noise. Bradley lunged forward, his expensive designer cuffs dragging across his dinner plate, knocking a silver butter knife onto the floor with a sharp, echoing clatter. "This is a lie," Bradley hissed, his face contorting into a mask of pure, unadulterated desperation. "You forged this, Sarah. Grandma was 82 years old and completely out of her mind at the end. She didn't know anything about asset protection or corporate law. You manipulated an old, dying woman to steal my company's liquidity." "Grandma was the sharpest person in this family, Bradley," I replied, my voice holding its low, clinical chill. "She saw exactly what you and Dad were doing. She watched you liquidate my $85,000 childhood safety fund to finance a luxury car detailing app that went completely bankrupt within 12 months. She saw how you treated our family legacy as a personal piggy bank. She didn't need manipulation. She requested this trust herself." My father didn't scream. He sat rigid, his eyes fixed on the certified county recorder's stamp on the front page of the leather portfolio. His right hand, still gripping the expensive silver pen, began to shake so violently that the metal clicked rhythmically against the mahogany table grid. Slowly, he looked up at me. The smooth, confident commercial real estate mogul who had dictated terms to me my entire life had completely vanished. In his place sat a man whose entire financial architecture was crumbling in real time. "Sarah," Arthur said, his voice dropping into a rough, raspy whisper that sounded like gravel being dragged across asphalt. "You don't understand the scope of what you're doing. This isn't a sibling rivalry. This isn't a game about who gets the lake house. Bradley's syndication firm is facing an immediate structural default with the state bank. I co-signed the commercial credit lines using my own brokerage firm's assets as collateral. If we don't record the title transfer to Ridgeline Development by Friday morning at 9 o'clock, the bank will initiate a forensic audit. My business will be frozen. Everything I've built over 30 years will be pulled into liquidation. Then I suggest you hire a very good defense attorney, Dad," I said, pushing the portfolio back into my bag and sliding his unsigned quitclaim deed across the table. My mother, Elinor, finally broke her silence. Her voice carried a sharp, piercing pitch that caused the diners at the neighboring booth to turn their heads in our direction. "How dare you?" she whispered, her eyes flashing with a cold, maternal fury. "Arthur built the roof over your head. We fed you, we clothed you. We paid for your suburban lifestyle, and now you're sitting there in a cheap drugstore blazer, smugly destroying your brother's career and your father's business. You are an ungrateful, malicious child. If you do this, if you walk out of this restaurant without signing that waiver, you are dead to this family. You will no longer be our daughter. You will be completely on your own." "I have been on my own since a rainy Tuesday morning in November, Mom," I said, looking between her rigid, defensive face and my father's empty eyes. "The day you liquidated my grandfather's education fund and told me that my future was a necessary sacrifice for Bradley's vanity was the day you stopped being my parents. You didn't protect me then. Why should I sacrifice my grandmother's legacy to protect your mistakes now?" I stood up from the plush velvet booth. I didn't wait for the waiter to bring the check. I didn't look back at Bradley, who had buried his head in his hands, muttering frantic calculations about bank default clauses. I walked out of the marble room, my heels clicking a steady, unhurried rhythm against the marble tile, and stepped out into the crisp, dark Columbus night. The rising tension of the next 48 hours felt like a slow-motion car crash that I was watching from a perfectly safe distance. By Thursday morning, the psychological warfare had officially begun. My parents didn't call my phone directly. They knew their numbers were blocked. Instead, they weaponized the extended family network. My Aunt Catherine called me at 7 in the morning, her voice dripping with artificial, frantic concern. "Sarah, sweetie, your mother is in absolute hysterics down here. She says you're holding a legal grudge over an old savings account. Your father's blood pressure is through the roof. You can't let your brother's company collapse over a piece of lakefront land. We are Mitchells, darling. We don't settle family matters in courtrooms." "The matter is already settled, Aunt Catherine," I told her, my voice flat, professional, and unyielding. The property is held in an irrevocable trust. There is nothing to negotiate. I hung up and immediately dialed Margaret Vance's direct line. They're looking for a backdoor, I told my attorney as I sat at the small kitchen island of my studio apartment, watching the morning sun slice through the blinds. They can look all they want, Sarah, Margaret replied, the crisp scratch of legal files shifting over her receiver line. I spent yesterday afternoon pulling the full county transaction logs. Your father's real estate lawyer actually attempted to file an emergency affidavit of heirship yesterday at 3:30 p.m., trying to claim that your grandmother was mentally incompetent when the trust was recorded in 2024. But I had already filed our lease pendens asterisk, the formal public notice of pending legal interest, at 8:15 yesterday morning. The county clerk automatically rejected his filing on chain of title grounds. Their hands are completely tied. What's Bradley's next move? I asked. Desperation, Margaret said, her tone dropping into a serious, guarded register. A real estate agent who bets $500,000 on land he doesn't own will do terrifying things when the bank default clock hits 0. Stay away from the lake house this weekend, Sarah. I mean it. But I couldn't stay away. That evening, a wave of profound emotional exhaustion hit me like a physical blow. I sat on the floor of my tiny studio apartment, surrounded by finance textbooks and corporate balance sheets, and I broke down. The tears came without warning, not a loud, dramatic collapse, but a quiet, crushing overflow of 27 years of absolute invisibility. I cried because I wished my father had been the kind of man who would have celebrated my finance degree instead of calculating how my corporate modules could shield Bradley's debt. I wished my mother had looked at my state math Olympiad ribbon with a fraction of the adoration she gave to Bradley's bankrupt tech brochures. I wished I had a normal family who loved me for who I was, rather than what they could strip from my side of the table. But as I wiped my face and caught my reflection in the dark glass of the apartment window, I felt the sorrow burn away, leaving something cold, hard, and entirely crystalline in its wake. Wishes don't hold up under a forensic financial audit. Irrevocable trusts do. I stood up, walked to my desk, and opened the small wooden box my grandmother had left me. Inside, wrapped in a blue plaid handkerchief that still held the faint, sweet scent of linseed oil and white pine, was the original, handwritten letter Evelyn had tucked into the desk drawer at Cedar Lake. I read her shaky but deliberate cursive line by line. They will focus entirely on the wrong value, Sarah. They will measure my home in dollar signs and developer payouts. But you are the one who noticed the roof needed patching before you ever asked what the land was worth. Take care of it. It took care of you first. A plan began to form in my mind. A cold, defensive architecture that would ensure my family could never hunt me again. On Friday morning, at precisely 8:45, 15 minutes before the state bank's default deadline, I drove my used Honda up the winding mountain road toward Cedar Lake. The air was damp. The ancient white pines cast long, dark shadows across the gravel lane, and the lake sat flat and gray under a heavy overcast sky. I parked in the gravel patch my grandfather had leveled himself, stepped onto the porch, and heard the familiar, low creak of the second step. I didn't go inside to hide. I went inside to document. I set my laptop on the butcher block kitchen table, connected my phone to a secure mobile hotspot, and opened a live video conference line with Margaret Vance and Thomas Graham, the senior forensic auditor from Mitchell and Partners, who had managed my grandmother's estate accounts for a decade. "We are live, Sarah," Thomas said, his silver-framed reading glasses reflecting the data grids on his screen. "I've just finalized the comprehensive asset tracing reports for the Mitchell Family Trust. We have the complete, verified timeline of your childhood safety fund liquidation from November 2019. The signature card authorized by your father has been digitally cross-referenced with the funds transfer into Bradley's Tech app account." "Is it airtight?" I asked, looking out the kitchen window as the headlights of a black luxury sedan cut through the pine trees at the edge of the driveway. "It's an absolute paper trail, Sarah," Thomas confirmed, his voice devoid of any emotional warmth. Your father didn't just redirect family assets. He executed a custodian transfer without filing the mandatory tax disclosures, which means his commercial brokerage firm is currently sitting on an undocumented $85,000 liability. If the state bank reviews these files during their structural audit this morning, it won't just freeze his commercial lines. It will trigger a formal state revenue investigation. The car door outside slammed shut with a heavy, explosive thud. I looked through the glass pane of the screen door. My father, Arthur, and my brother, Bradley, were walking up the porch steps. Bradley wasn't wearing his custom suit anymore. His hair was disheveled, his designer tie hung loose around his unbuttoned collar, and his eyes held the frantic, wild look of a cornered animal that had run completely out of rooms to hide in. My father walked behind him, his shoulders hunched forward, looking 10 years older than he had 48 hours prior at the Marble Room. I left the video call active on the kitchen table, walked to the front door, unlocked the deadbolt, and pushed the screen door open about 3 inches. I stayed behind the frame. "Sarah," my father said, stopping on the second step. He didn't cross his arms, and he didn't use his boardroom voice. He held up a thick manila folder, his fingers trembling so hard the paper rattled in the damp air. "The bank deadline is in exactly 10 minutes. The Ridgeline Development buyers are standing by at the county recorder's office downtown. They've increased their offer to $500,000 cash for an immediate, unencumbered title transfer. If you don't sign this updated corporate variance form right now, the default notice becomes public record. My brokerage firm is done. Everything is gone." "You shouldn't have cosign lines for a company that built its foundation on vanity, Dad," I said, my voice cutting through the quiet mountain air like a scalpel. Bradley stepped past my father, his face twisting into a mottled, furious red as he slammed his palm against the wooden porch railing. "Shut up, Sarah, just shut your mouth," Bradley screamed, his composure shattering entirely in front of the empty lake. "You think you're smart. You think your little corporate honors degree makes you a mogul. You're a junior financial analyst living in a rented box in the city. You don't know anything about real business. If this syndication firm goes down, I'll be hit with personal breach of contract penalties. Ridgeline will sue me for fraud because I guaranteed a clean title search. I could lose my real estate license. I could face a civil judgment that will bury me for the rest of my life. Then you should have performed a title search before you signed a contract for land you didn't own, Bradley," I said, looking directly into his frantic, wild eyes. "Sarah, please," my father broke in, his voice cracking down the center as he took a step closer to the screen door. "Your mother and I are losing our home. The bank will leverage the suburban house to clear the commercial default lines. We have nowhere else to go. This cabin was supposed to be our safety net." "This cabin was Grandma Evelyn's sanctuary," I said, holding the edge of the screen door with steady, cold fingers. "And she made sure it would never belong to a plumber, a lunch lady, or a real estate agent who measures love in developer payouts. You have 9 minutes left on your bank clock, Dad. I suggest you drive back to the city and start reviewing your liquidation options." Bradley lunged toward the door, his hand grabbing the silver handle, his face inches from the screen. "Sign the paper, Sarah," he roared, thrusting the manila folder against the wire mesh. "Sign it or I swear to God." "Bradley, stop," a voice boomed from the kitchen table inside. I turned my head slightly. The laptop screen was fully visible through the glass. Thomas Graham and Margaret Vance were staring directly at the camera line, their recorded interface flashing a red asterisk recording active indicator at the top of the dashboard. "Mr. Bradley Mitchell," Margaret Vance's voice carried a terrifying, professional steel through the laptop speakers. "My name is Margaret Vance, trust attorney for the Mitchell Family Irrevocable Trust. This video line is currently being recorded and logged on a secure corporate server. If you attempt to use physical force, intimidation, or duress to compel a trustee to execute a property variance, I will immediately forward this footage to the county sheriff's office alongside a formal criminal referral for extortion and civil harassment. Step back from the door right now." Bradley's hand froze on the silver handle. The color drained from his face so fast it looked like something physical had pulled the life from his skin. Slowly, His gaze moved from my face, past the glass pane, to the glowing laptop dashboard on the kitchen table. My father, Arthur, let the manila folder slip from his fingers. The white corporate documents scattered across the wet wooden porch steps, their neat, printed columns turning gray under the damp mountain fog. The grandfather clock inside the cabin hallway began to chime. 9 o'clock. The bank deadline had officially crossed the line. The commercial default was no longer a private corporate crisis. It was a matter of public legal record. The scattered papers on the porch steps began to absorb the heavy moisture of the lakefront fog, the crisp white edges curling into damp, gray shapes. My brother Bradley's hand slowly slipped away from the silver door handle, his arm dropping to his side like a heavy weight. He didn't look at me. He didn't look at my father. He stood staring at the porch floorboards, his breathing shallow and rapid, the absolute realization of his financial ruin settling into his bones. Arthur Mitchell, a man who had commanded corporate boardrooms for over 30 years, sank onto the top step of the porch, burying his face in his hands. His expensive wool coat dragged across the wet wood, but he didn't notice. The silence that filled the space between us was absolute, broken only by the steady, rhythmic lap of the Cedar Lake waves against the old wooden boat dock. "It's over," my father whispered, his voice completely hollowed out, stripped of every ounce of that boardroom authority he had used to dismiss me my entire life. "The bank will initiate the foreclosure on the Columbus office by noon. The brokerage assets are tied directly to those commercial lines. 30 years of work, Sarah, gone, because you couldn't find it in your heart to let us salvage the firm." I pushed the screen door open all the way and stepped out onto the porch, looking down at the man who had liquidated my childhood safety fund without a second thought. "I didn't destroy your firm, Dad," I said, my voice dropping into a low, crystalline register. "You destroyed it the moment you decided that my future was a cheap chips stack you could pull from the table to fund Bradley's vanity. You chose to gamble your entire professional legacy on a boy who builds on arrogance instead of substance. Grandma Evelyn didn't create this crisis. She simply built the shelter that kept your structural failure from pulling me down with you." Bradley's head snapped up, his jaw tight, his eyes flashing with a sudden, final burst of desperate rage. "You think you've won, Sarah? You think you're safe up here in your little kingdom? We'll contest the trust. We'll hire the best litigation attorneys in the state. We'll drag this through the courts until you're drowning in legal fees." "With what capital, Bradley?" I asked, looking him dead in the eye. "The bank is freezing your accounts in exactly 45 minutes. Ridgeline Development is already preparing a civil suit against you for fraud and misrepresentation of title because you signed a guaranteed purchase agreement for a property you never owned. You don't have the funds to hire a defense attorney, let alone drag an airtight irrevocable trust through probate court. You ran out of rooms to hide in the moment you stepped onto this porch." My father didn't argue. He slowly stood up, brushing the damp leaves off his trousers with a heavy, broken motion. He looked at the scattered corporate variance documents lying on the wet steps, then looked back at me one final time. There was no anger left in his face. There was only recognition, the terrifying understanding that he had underestimated his quiet daughter so completely that he had lost the single valuable asset he had left. "Come on, Bradley," Arthur said, his voice stripped raw as he turned toward the gravel driveway. "There's nothing left for us here." I watched from the porch as the black luxury sedan backed out of the pine trees, its tires crunching slowly over the wet gravel before disappearing down the winding mountain road. I stood there until the sound of the engine completely faded into the wind. Then I walked back into the kitchen, picked up the laptop, and looked at Margaret Vance and Thomas Graham, who were still monitoring the secure video line. "The default is public record now," I told them. "I've already received the formal notification from the state banking portal, Sarah," Thomas said, adjusting his reading glasses. "The forensic audit has been initiated. Your father's commercial lines are frozen, but your trust accounts are entirely untouched. The $85,000 asset tracing report has been officially logged with the state revenue investigator as a non-disclosed custodian transfer. The architecture is complete." "Thank you, Thomas. Thank you, Margaret," I said quietly. "Take care of that house, Sarah." Margaret said with a soft, genuine smile before closing the connection. Evelyn knew exactly what she was doing. The social and financial fallout over the next 3 months moved through the Mitchell family network like a slow-moving demolition ball, and each impact made a clean, definitive sound. Arthur Mitchell didn't contest the trust. Margaret Vance was right. The legal fees alone would have buried him, and the case had absolutely zero legal ground. An irrevocable trust established by a mentally competent grantor, witnessed by independent notaries, and recorded years before death is about as airtight as state property law gets. Instead, my father had to watch his commercial brokerage firm be systematically dismantled by the state bank's liquidation team to clear Bradley's $300,000 default. The suburban country club house in Columbus was placed on the market within 30 days. My mother, Elinor, had to pack 30 years of pristine luxury into cardboard boxes, moving her crystal stemware and designer gowns into a small, 2-bedroom rented townhouse on the outer edges of the city. She took a position as a receptionist at a local dental office, her first job in nearly 3 decades. When her country club associates asked why she was working, she told them she simply wanted to stay busy. Nobody believed her. The small-town real estate circles already knew the truth. Bradley's real estate syndication firm was permanently dissolved under a Chapter 7 bankruptcy order. Ridgeline Development pursued him for breach of contract, securing a $75,000 civil judgment against his personal assets. His real estate license was suspended indefinitely by the state board pending the outcome of the fraud referral, completely cutting off his ability to operate in the commercial sector. The crown prince of the Mitchell legacy was officially stripped of his stage. My parents and Bradley didn't speak to me for 12 weeks. The silence was permanent, heavy, and completely clean. Then, last week, my mother sent a handwritten letter to my studio apartment. The envelope was slightly creased, stamped with a basic postmark, and devoid of the elegant calligraphy she usually used for her country club invitations. I sat at my small kitchen island, my golden retriever snoring softly at my feet, and opened it reluctantly. "Sarah," she wrote, her elegant cursive looking slightly looser, slightly tired. "I am writing this because your father and I are struggling to understand how things went so wrong. We made decisions for the good of this family, based on the opportunities we believed Bradley could deliver. I admit we made mistakes with your childhood safety fund, but we were under immense financial pressure. You completely dismantled your father's legacy in front of the entire real estate community. We are still your parents, Sarah. Blood doesn't just vanish because of legal papers. We want to know if you are open to meeting for coffee next month to figure out how to rebuild this family." I read the letter twice. I didn't cry. I didn't feel a surge of anger, and I didn't feel a need for revenge. I felt only a calm, absolute clarity. I took a black pen and wrote a 4-sentence response on a plain piece of paper. "Mom, I read your letter. I forgave you and Dad a long time ago for my own peace of mind, but forgiveness is a personal boundary, not an invitation to negotiate. I am open to cautious contact under one strict condition. We will never discuss money, real estate, or the trust assets ever again. If that boundary is respected, we can start with a 15-minute video call next month. If not, the door stays closed. You decide." I mailed the response the following morning. She accepted the terms within 48 hours. It wasn't a dramatic movie reconciliation. It wasn't the childhood I deserved or the warm, supportive family dynamic that other people take for granted. But it was real. It was structured. And for the first time in my 27 years, the terms of our relationship were entirely under my control. Today is Sunday, the first week of June. The morning sun is clearing the ancient white pines at Cedar Lake, casting long, golden stripes across the water. The fog has completely lifted, revealing a pale blue sky that looks perfectly clean. I am sitting on the porch steps of the timber frame cottage, a warm cup of coffee resting between my hands, watching a blue heron stand perfectly motionless in the shallows near the boat dock. The second step still creaks. I haven't fixed it yet, mostly because the sound reminds me of the Saturdays I spent here with Grandma Evelyn, going over title deeds while the winter wind howled against the logs. I look around the lakefront lot. The porch has been fresh painted, the weather stripping on the back door has been replaced, and the roof shingles have been completely reinforced against the upcoming summer storms. I didn't win a war against my parents. There is no real winning when the people who were supposed to protect your future are the very ones who tried to liquidate it. You don't get a trophy for surviving your own blood. But I kept a promise, and for the first time in my life, I am standing on solid ground that belongs entirely to me. Not because I fought with rage, but because two people loved me enough to plan for the storm years before it ever hit the coast. Grandma Evelyn couldn't change who my father was. She couldn't make my mother less proud or Bradley less arrogant. But she could make sure I had ground to stand on when the vanity of their architecture finally came crashing down. I take a slow sip of my coffee, the heat warming my palms, and listen to the quiet ripple of the water against the shore. The trust is clear, the title is clean, and the door is completely mine. If you are listening to this story tonight and you see yourself in my background, if you are the quiet child, the overlooked daughter, the one they think will always comply with their casual cruelties, I want you to hear me clearly. Stop waiting for them to see your worth. See it yourself first. Build your own boundaries with the data, the facts, and the people who actually show up for you when the columns run red. And when they finally turn around and realize what they lost, let them find a door that you control. You decide when it opens. You decide how wide. You decide exactly who walks through. That isn't revenge, my friends. That is architecture. Thank you so much for staying with me until the very end of this journey. If this story of hidden strength and legal boundaries spoke to your heart tonight, please don't forget to hit that subscribe button, turn on your notifications, and share this video with someone who needs to remember their own worth today. Check the description below for links to similar stories about ordinary people who found the courage to stand their ground. Until next time, stay safe, stay steady, and take care of your own foundation.